Hello, my name is Tianna Henry, and I am zooming in from the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. We wish to acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land, traditional territory named Tekaronto, where the trees meet the water, the gathering place. We do not support colonial forces and undermine, distort, or erase the vital role of Indigenous people in our world. We would like to pay respects to the elders, past and present. If you do not reside in Toronto, Tekaronto, I encourage you to find out whose land you're sitting on. A great resource is native-land.ca. So like I said, my name is Tianna Henry, and I'm the events coordinator at Glad Day Bookshop. For those that do not know, Glad Day is the world's longest surviving queer and trans bookshop. There have been many iterations of Glad Day in its 52-year history, most famously at the Yonge and Wellesley location, where it functioned for many decades as a community space and gay bookstore. Glad Day's history includes multiple battles with the state. Our so-called pornographic materials were often seized at the border. The most notable of all was a case that reached the Supreme Court. This case was won and changed the ways in which obscenity laws could apply to materials written by queer and trans writers. 10 years ago, when Glad Day was close to closing for good, a collective of community members came together to buy it. They moved the shop to its current location in the Church and Wellesley neighborhood. Here it functions as a bar, cafe, restaurant, and community space. When the pandemic hit, we were able to raise funds for immediate grants for folks who had lost the bulk of their income. During this time, we launched Glad Day TV, our virtual events platform. We are starting to reopen for in-person events and community meetups, and will continue to use this platform to host incredible events like this one. Speaking of which, thank you all for coming, and please join me in welcoming our very talented authors. We are very lucky to have Nathan Burgoine as our moderator for this evening. Nathan, him, grew up a reader and studied literature in university while making a living as a bookseller. His first published short story was Heart, in the collection Fool for Love, New Gay Fiction. His first novel, Light, is available from Bold Strokes Books and was a finalist for both the Lambda Literary Award for LGBT sci-fi fantasy horror and the Botya BOTYA 2013 Gay and Lesbian Adult Fiction Forward Award. And his first YA novel, Exit Plans for Teenage Freaks, was a finalist for the Aurora Prix Award. He continues to write shorter fiction, novellas, and novels, usually spec fic, often romance, and always queer. His most recent YA novella, Hope Echoes, just released in the Bold Strokes Books collection, 3 Left Turns to Nowhere. Welcome, Nathan, and thank you for moderating this event. Next, we have Stephen Graham King. Stephen Graham King lives in Toronto. His first book, Just Breathe, tells the funny, blunt, uncompromising story of his 3-year battle with metastatic synovial sarcoma. Since then, he is concentrating on writing speculative fiction, in particular queer-themed space opera, and his first fiction has appeared in the anthologies North of Infinity 2, Desolate Places, Ruins, Metropolis, and the forthcoming Nothing Without Us 2. His first novel, Chasing Cold, was released in 2012, followed by the first books in the Maverick Heart Cycle, Soul's Blood 2016, Gatecrasher 2017, A Congress of Ships 2019, and the newly released Ghost Lightburn, launched on April 15th. Congratulations on the new arrival. Please join me in welcoming Avi Silver. Avi Silver is a speculative fiction author, 2 Dark Moons 2019, 3 Seeking Stars 2021, Riesling nominated poet, and the co-managing editor of Augur magazine. Find their short fiction In Common Bonds, an aromantic speculative anthology, and their poetry in Strange Horizons and Uncanny magazine. In 2018, they co-founded the Shale Project, an award-winning indie arts collective, and have not stopped world building since. For more information, visit mixavisilver.com, mxavisilver.com. For lizard pictures, follow them on Twitter at the Scream Bean. Last but not least, we have Sienna Tristen. Sienna is an author, poet, and literary organizer living in Treaty 3 territory who explores queer platonic partnership, the non-human world, and myth-making in their work. The first installment of their award-winning fantasy duology, The Heretic's Guide to Homecoming, came out from indie arts collective, The Shale Project, in 2018. The sequel is forthcoming October 2022. We're very excited for that. You can find their poetry in Augur magazine and Plentitude, and their chapbook, Hortus and Amarium, a new herbal for the queer heart, is forthcoming from Frog Hollow Press. When the sun is up, they work with the world on the street, Toronto, to showcase the coolest Canadian and Indigenous literature. Welcome, everybody, and please take it away, Nathan.
Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome. We are so happy to be here. Virtually is fine. Being anywhere right now is such a treat. So I'm actually going to have us do quick little 5-minute readings for you all in the audience to get a taste of what we're doing. And then I'm basically going to sit back and enjoy grilling these wonderful people about their books, their world building, and their queer and disabled wonderful futures. So I'm going to do this in the same order that we were introduced, which I think was alphabetical. And I realize that makes me go first, and that feels a little selfish, but then I don't have to be nervous for the rest of the evening. So I'm going to go that way. I will be reading from Hope Echoes. That's my latest novella. It's one of 3 novellas included in 3 Left Turns for Nowhere, which is a bunch of interlinked contemporary spec fic YA, all set in the same northern town in Ontario. My story involves a kid who can see echoes of the past replaying, and he bumps into a echo in a secondhand bookshop when he picks up a book, and he realizes there's a love letter tucked in this book, or at the moment he doesn't know it's a love letter yet, but he finds a letter in the book. And the story begins with him in a diner because he's trapped in this town because of a fallen tree, trying to sort of figure out what to do with himself because he's stuck here. And then he realizes what this letter might be. Once he had 3 drawings, he tried his phone again. Nothing new on the social media if the tree was still there. He pulled out the envelope out of the book and sighed. Eleanor L. Kelly. The door to the diner opened. Sorry. Wow. I apologize. My bookmark fell out of the book. Eleanor L. Kelly, an impossible perfect penmanship. It meant nothing to him, but the memory of the girl's tears imbued it with something far too familiar. Heartbreak, maybe, or definitely loneliness. He blew out a breath and gave the envelope a good long stare, but nothing happened. Annoyed with himself, he flipped it over. The flap came open. He pressed it with his finger to see if it would reseal itself. It popped open again. Okay, well, at this point, it would be shirking my duty not to read this letter, he said. It didn't reply. Despite his completely founded and objectionably reasonable responsibility to read what was inside, Fielding couldn't help feel a little bit bashful and checked the diner to make sure no one was looking at him, not that he was doing anything wrong, undid the flap and pulled out the paper. He stared. 16,313, 16,435, 16,467. It is full of numbers. What the hell? He smoothed out the page and scanned up and down, but nothing changed. It was a piece of paper covered in numbers and grouped in sets of 3. Why would that make a girl cry? Math homework? Fielding jumped, trying not to glare at Joshua, the cute diner boy who had come back with his order. Oh my God, please stop doing that. You're just too easy. The guy had zero guilt on display. It should be annoying, but it wasn't, which was in and of itself annoying. He held up the plate of grilled cheese and smiled. Here you go. Fielding moved the book and letter. The numbers caught his eye again. I don't think it's math homework. What is it then? I actually don't know. Hey, have you ever heard of someone named Eleanor Kelly? Joshua shook his head. No, sorry. Fielding exhaled. That's okay. Well, enjoy. I recommend dipping into the sweet and spicy ketchup in between bites, but you can do your own thing. I'm going to walk away now. When I come back, I will stomp my feet and whistle. Oh, you're very funny. That's what my boyfriend tells me, Joshua said. Enjoy decoding whatever that is. And a moment later, he was gone. Fielding sat there, napkin in hand, processing. Did he just... boyfriend? Huh. Conflicting feelings battled briefly in Fielding's stomach. Joshua, the cute diner boy, was gay or bi or pan. Hooray! And had a boyfriend. Oh. Still, why had he mentioned it to Fielding? Fielding had crappy gaydar, but he also didn't think he projected gay out into the world. Nerd, sure, but gay boy? How had he known? Huh. Maybe he just had great gaydar. It probably came with perfect teeth and nice chins. He took a bite of the sandwich and it was life-changing. Whatever that was, ketchup was the best thing he ever invented. He took a second bite, even better. By the time he'd finished the first triangle, Fielding agreed with Joshua's take. The mayo was okay, but the ketchup was what needed to happen in life. He noticed the letter again, off to its side where he'd left it. Good luck decoding whatever that is. Decoding. He pulled out his phone and typed in 3 number codes, and 15 minutes later, he found it. Book ciphers. Would she have tucked the letter into the book that actually decoded it? Did that even make sense? He wasn't sure. He picked up the book, eyed the first trio of numbers, and turned to page 16. 16,313 was I. Okay. 16,435 was do. He kept going. Not wish to be parted. He stopped, staring at the letter, eyeing what he tapped out on his phone as he went. Counting out 67 words is tedious, and the screen kept going dark in between words. He wished he brought his something to write on, but I do not wish to be parted. Tell me about it, book girl. You doing okay? Fielding turned to see Joshua there. I am. Hey, could I maybe borrow a pen and a piece of paper? Sure. Good book, he said as he poured. Not really my thing. Sense and Sensibility isn't your thing, but it's a classic. Fielding stared at him. Who has time to read books about straight people? Okay, fine. Would you believe it's not a book, actually? It's a key. Sorry? You were right. It's a code. Huh. Check me out. I'm a genius. Grilled cheese was okay? Life-changing. See, I do not lead you astray. I'll be back with a paper and pen. Once he had the paper and pen, he had enough time to decode the rest of the letter. The first sentence of the decoded letter set the tone for the rest. I do not wish to be parted. We have no choice. It's not up to us. I wish for you to remain here with me. I do not know how I will survive. My love for you is as precious as air. He thought of the girl, and he thought, I need to deliver this letter. And that's where I'll leave you. So I'm going to pass the baton now to Stephen Graham King, who's going to take us way, way, way into the future.
Hello, yes, I am going to read, unsurprisingly, from Ghostlight Moon, which is the newest book in my Maverick Heart Cycle, which is far future, super queer crypt adventure stories. This is a story about our main characters meeting an old friend who, unsurprisingly, is in trouble and needs help. At the end of the previous book, something terrible happened to one of our characters, and this short scene is aftermath of him in the new place. For a moment, he stood in front of the full-length mirror on the inside of the small bathroom cubicle, just looking at his body. The prosthetic elements were still new to him, black and shining where they replaced the damaged limbs and tissue he had lost on their last grand adventure. His left leg from the mid-thigh down, the mottled patch on the left side of his torso, and the patterning that extended down his left forearm, inky stripes that ended in two fully black fingers, ring and pinky. He'd held that arm up, shielding his face from the onslaught of burning energy. The doctors in the trauma center had told him that that was all that had kept him from having his entire skull fried into mush. As it was, they were shocked that he had held on long enough for Keenan Lexablue to get him into Brick's autodoc and the full stasis that had kept him alive. He stood just looking, taking in his body as he so often did now. The experimental cybernetic prosthetics were still alien to him. He still never quite managed to feel that those patches of black were really a part of him, even though they responded as completely natural as the rest of his body. The dull, aching numbness that still ran through these new artificial parts of his body was flaring, a murmur of pressure, like the air around those parts of his body pressed against him too tightly. He knew it was worse from the hours of physical work from within through him. He knew that however keenly he felt it now, it would ease, fade back to just a murmur once he was rested, though it would never truly leave. It would ebb and flow as a tide, pulled by forces that were only somewhat under his control. Diffuse cybernetic interface neuropathy, just a fancy tech term for his new normal. The surgeon who had supervised the team of cybernetic specialists that had performed the implantation and his subsequent recovery had laid it out in no uncertain terms. As it stood, there was nothing more they could do. It was advanced experimental technology. They had samples of every type of tissue from his body and were continually working at some kind of patch or upgrade that would fix the issue. David Adisi, Kane's other lover and the technarch of Brighter Light, the corporate colony state that had developed the bleeding edge technology and handed over without hesitation, had apologized over and over. Ember had no reason to doubt his sincerity. And Ember was unconditionally grateful to still be alive. This ever-present phantom sensation was just the price to be paid. And there was always a price to be paid. He'd learned that a long time ago. I am a patchwork, he thought. I am spare parts and adhesive. He sent a command from his node and the black patterns faded, taking on the exact tone of the skin around them, disappearing completely, but sending a spike of fresh, hot pain through the prostheses. No, that's not right either. There were still times he needed to blend in, render the changes to his body invisible. He knew that he never had to be seen any other way. The symbol command through his node would keep the changes invisible forever, but again, at a price. He had only ever done it to prove the capability to himself. Here on Brick, he was surrounded by the word family stuck in his throat, but whatever they were was something he needed and trusted, and he saw no reason to hide who he was from them. As for the rest of the world, he couldn't give a transcendent damn what they thought. Between his prosthetics and the neat white line of scar that bisected Lexablue's eye socket, they made quite a pair. With the utmost in reparative therapies, citizens of the Pangalactum generally kept their appearance as close to human norm as they could manage. Invisible deformities and differences were rare. He reversed the command and watched the black metallic sheen spread out again, making him mottled and uneven once more. This is real, he thought. This is the truth. At least this ache, this throb was tolerable, not like it once was, not like in those first hellish moments. In the in-between as they struggled to keep him alive, indescribable, inescapable agony that had blotted out all other knowledge, all sense of self. The whole universe had been pain. The battle armor had done its best to keep him drugged, but there were limits. That agony was nothing but a memory now, but time hadn't robbed it of its power. They'd given him his life and his mobility back. They'd given him therapy and counseling to adjust as they trained his mind and body to work again, to accept and use these foreign body parts. And they'd had to teach him how to walk again, too. His body now moved as it always had, thanks to months of therapy and grueling effort. All of his capabilities were back to where they had been. But that just made it harder in some ways. He'd known his body, what it could do so very well. To have it function the same, but look so different, still brought him up short. As he resolved to get up and get dressed to find himself something to eat, his node pinged with a message that was waiting for him in his personal queue, a small purple glow in the corner of his vision. He frowned, his brow creasing. Who could that be? A thought accepted the message, and the code string that identified it was instantly, almost painfully familiar to him. It was her. The message blossomed in his mind, projected across his vision and the inside of his eyelids when he closed his eyes. He was taken aback by the changes in her. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup or enhancement, and her hair was pulled back and tied, revealing the slope of her high forehead. It was her, and yet not her. She looked stripped down, fairer than he had ever seen her, a deeper way than just her physical appearance. Somehow the intervening year or so since he had seen her had aged her. At the same time, she projected a sense of calm, of peace that he had never seen in her eyes before. But she was worried about something. That much he could tell. He knew it as surely as he knew his own name and where he was. She spoke. Ember, it's Malika. I need your help.
Thank you. That was awesome. I always talk about Stephen's ability to world build on the fly, and that was such a wonderful example of it. So I will pass on the baton again, this time to Avi. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Avi Silver. I'm going to be reading from Three Seeking Stars, the second book in the Sound Cycle. So I'm going to be reading from a chapter starring on the clueless 11th prince of the Chowsudor Empire. In the culture that he is from, warriors of a certain rank will go through a training where they live with someone, spend all their time with them, fight with them, and then they have a fight to the death with the expectation that the living member will do the work in the living world and the one who dies will guide them from the spiritual realm. Unfortunately, since On sort of carried out this ritual, he has not heard at all from Shen, his counterpart, until a moment where he is captured. So think of this as a conversation between On and his ghost boyfriend who never made it past It's Complicated, which included their class differences. So, do you remember what I told you about the 1,000-hour siege? On couldn't see how that was relevant. He couldn't see at all. The fabric that had been stretched over his eyes turned the world hazy and imperfect. Feeling the panic that threatened to overtake him, he leaned into his other senses. This isn't a test, On. It's a real question. The language all around him was unfamiliar, buzzing cumbersome in his ears. If they were still speaking Dulpangpa, he wasn't sure he'd even be able to tell, and who knew if Somang would help him anymore. His wrist tugs uselessly against the rope, earning him a sharp jab between the shoulder blades and an insult he could not understand. You're not paying attention, are you? Another shove from behind forced him to walking again, one step after another, uncertain of where he would land. He squared his shoulders, breathing slowly in through his nose and out through his mouth. He stumbled in the dirt and told himself that he knew how to be fearless. The heat in the back of his neck shifted, siphoning into his earlobe. It throbbed with old memory, and he bit back a groan. That's more like it. While I have you, listen closely. Stop that. Don't start wondering after me, you idiot. Listen to my words. Trust me. All right, so the 1,000-hour siege was the last strategic battle in the taking of Chelsea. The Imperial army moved on Gurin, the last remaining sovereign region of the continent. It had been a long and difficult harvest for Gurin. People were hungry, and the feudal lords weren't feeling generous with their granaries. They were too busy keeping an eye on the oncoming army, saving up for themselves. And the army did come. But the Empire did something unexpected. It approached the peasantry. This time, instead of terrorizing the lower classes, the liberators took care of them. They brought imported goods to soothe Gurin's hunger. They built a magnificent road to open up trade with the rest of Chelsea. They brought music, beautiful music. Soon, less and less of the lower classes' taxes made it into the walled city of Jinfiol, where the wealthy hoarded their bounty and hid. Of course, the peasant towns that remained loyal to Gurin's feudal lords felt the pressure from the Imperial army. Embargoes could pop up anywhere, and the punishment for stolen goods sure was steep that year. But that's discernment for you, huh? On wondered where they had put his armor, if they had just left it out there in the trees. The thought was unexpectedly upsetting. He hadn't even wanted that armor, but his father had been so glad to gift it to him. He had looked so proud. Pay attention on. I'm trying to keep you alive here. By the time the Imperial force made it to Jinfiol, the city had already begun to feel the farmers' ongoing lack of tribute. Even still, they refused to open their doors, and thus began the 1,000-hour siege. It was brutal. At one point, the army allowed a shipment of grain as a mercy, but it was rotten through. Then the water supply turned foul. Divine intervention. And while the wealthy lords suffered inside the city of Jinfiol, the peasantry thrived in the countryside. At least until Imperial assistance stops. The rations were halted. The roads stopped being built. No more music, that's for sure. And it was all because Jinfiol wouldn't open its gates to the invaders and give in to the force that had tilled the rest of the continent. The Imperial army was organized and powerful. They could have taken Jinfiol on their own and paid the blood price, but it was cheaper to motivate the farmers with hunger and propaganda. The rumors stoked by the courtesan general, the wicked doings of the nobles, the feasts they made of their servants, the intention to punish the farmers who accepted imperial aid, made the poor an army in their own right. Wasn't she a great-great aunt of yours or something? Anyway, the city fell in 1,000 hours. 98 years and 1,000 hours, and Chelsea had claimed Gurin and the continent for the empire. Death at the prongs of a pitchfork rather than the edge of a blade. Why are you telling me this? On mumbled in Chowsidor. He felt like a madman, drunk on information, on the pure sense of spirit coursing through him. He couldn't remember the last time the boy had come through so clearly. You've been so quiet, Shen. I thought that you— Shut up, Sonkar, snapped his captor, half shoving him up a few bumpy stairs. I'm telling you this because there's something you don't know, younger Anshen. The name jabbed at him, made him want to weep, made him hungry for his blade. I grew up in Haujest, one of those peasant towns in the land my ancestors called Gurin. No one alive remembers the world before imperial rule, but we know the stories, the empire's stories, and our own. We're not stupid, on. We know how we were used and to what end. We had little love for Jinfiol, but the road Chelsea built was only ever intended to lead to the heart of the empire. A vein, not an artery. Don't get me wrong, we get by. It's not so bad back home for the simple farm folk smiling and waving when the royal parade comes through for the anniversary of our imperial adoption. New holidays, new language, aren't we oh so thankful? It's easy to smile at someone who only ever passes through town. Sometimes I wonder how many years of loyalty you can buy with 1,000 hours. I know. The empire is generous, and so the empire is everlasting. Everyone loves the empire, they say so in the books. And they built us a road. But there are cracks in the road on. It wasn't put down even, not even at the start. Maybe you don't see them, but I thought you ought to know. Better late than never, right? The blindfold was yanked from his face. Thank you so much.
That was so evocative. Thank you.
Thank you.
And again, last but not least, I will repeat it. We have Sienna Tristen. Take it away.
I'm like truly not least. I promise, everybody. I promise. I will try and one up Avi. This is our game. So I'm going to read from the second half of the Heretic's Guide to Homecoming Duology. So this will be coming out in October. I tend to like to read the myths that are included in the book because they don't require any context. You get to just enjoy them and then you can pick them apart at your leisure. So the only context I'm going to give you is that this is about a new place that we're going. Yay! The great wheel is turning. Now that is what they say in the heartland of Shaipuri when the end of an era approaches. Not every generation gets to utter those words. The ages of the rainforest are governed by its gods, by what builds the karst and the marsh and the deep wood. And the tenure of such creatures runs long, 70 years, 200 more. The length of an era is the lifespan of its god, the time for that which that creator can pour its vitality into this world. But it is the first thing a heartland child learns to say. The first talisman stone they hold beneath their tongue, because you never know when that vitality will be spent, and the old god wither and die, and a new one come to take the world from its failing hands. When the last floating motes of life's exhale trickle out, in the great demon silence before the next inhale comes, in that reverent, dangerous stillness, they look to one another and say, the great wheel is turning. That takes preternatural skill to hear the faint titan creak of that wheel as it sets to motion upon its axle, to guess where it will come to rest anew. For this, the Heartlanders turn to the wise women. Crafty, canny, the wise women live with one eye on their cosmic calendar, blessed and burdened as they are with its stewardship. Over 2,500 years, they've learned how to predict these transitions, how to prepare for their arrival. The sacred knowledge makes them the midwives of this world, well-versed in the ways of swaddling and suckling a newborn era, in seeing those dawn days through their first bout of colic, of pox. Even fully established, every creator has its quirks, its preferences and predilections, and the wise women learn to interpret these too, and so characterize the many nights ahead for their people. In time, Shaipuri's heartland found a certain reliability in the turning of the great wheel. And insofar as peace lies in a land where even the flowers will hunt you for sport, it was peace that they found, until a spoke broke. One day, a few hundred years ago, a blight hit the rainforest of Shaipuri. The canopy withered, the rivers burned, the beasts grew ragged and haggard and lean. The wise women had read the death of the old creator already in the gray of the moss and the smell of the rot, but nothing had warned them of decay on this scale. So a council of all tribes was called, and the wise women gathered from the 6 directions and practiced what haruspicy they could upon the entrails of the old world. By their combined power, they gleaned the terrible truth. The era being ushered in was governed by a young god, a sickly god, not yet strong enough to support the plenteous rainforest the old one had left to it. The world had been passed into shaky hands. If those hands could not be steadied, the world was sure to drop, and no god could save it from oblivion then. What do you do when your god doesn't have the power to hold you safe, you wonder? You help them attain it, of course. With the help of the wise woman, the sickly god hewed itself into 18 pieces. 18 supernatural beings who implanted themselves within each of the Heartlands tribes. They were known as the stakes in the ground, holding fast the land, or else the taproots of God, placed there to milk the soil of its latent strength. But the name they came to be known by above all other was the heavenly seeds, because these words most accurately depicted their future. The seeds came down to the earthly realm to be fertilized, to be fed the power they needed to hold the world together, and it was by the sacrifice of the living that this power would be derived. It was by the sacrifice of the living that the Creator would draw the might to make the rainforest flourish again. So the Heartland began its ritual war. Battles were held, not solely martial in nature, for a creator needs more than fighting might to rule. Contests in reed flute and jump rope and poetry were equally revered, harvested an equal number of losers. It was not such a bad thing to lose in the Heartland. It meant your life had reached its peak, its apex. It meant you were ripe. Each of the heavenly seeds had imbibed a tribe with its essence, providing them with guidance, with the preferred offering and a name to invoke as the offering was made. The seeds required different donors for different reasons: adults, children, birds, black caimans. The fertility idols Farhati and Ga'am split the bellies of pregnant women to harvest the raw creative power within. The river gods and rainmakers, Hunanun and Johastasana and Azmkahabar, devoured children for the purity of their life-giving tears. The keeper of the sun and stars, Baramsula, needed sacrificial pyres to keep the celestial bodies lit. By the bloody mulch of mortality, the seeds were nourished, taproots fattening on the hopes of the slain. And one day those roots would push forth blooms. One day, what once was split would splice. One day, when each seed was sufficiently strengthened, these supernatural beings would battle each other, mirroring the sacrifice provided by humankind, and consume the bodies of the defeated until only one remained. Now this seed, fully sprouted, radiant with the willing pain of all Shaipuri, would transform into the Heartland's new creator god, replacing its old sickly aspect with a resplendent reincarnation, preserving its seedly name to honor the tribe who had reared it. By such means, the paradise of Shaipuri would be revived. By such means, the land would be resurrected and its people find peace again. By the will of the wise woman, by the war of heavenly seeds, the great wheel would turn once more to an era more shining and bountiful than any come before. Azurk stood up, gathering her newly formed fabric as she rose. She knotted the material around her waist, tucked and wrapped it to resemble the loose trouser-like garments the Bunjavaktans sported. Then she looked down and saw Renoa still sitting there. Renoa, and the face he must have been making. It is a bit of a gruesome story, isn't it? She admitted. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I once had the dubious pleasure of getting to introduce an award after you. And I remember thinking like, oh no, follow them? You got to be crazy, Nathan. Anyway, so.
Quoted like Jane Hirschfield or Rebecca Solnit or something. Yeah.
So thank you to everyone. That was wonderful. And I am actually going to jump in with a bit of a prize, which is probably a surprise that we're having a little contest at the moment. So Renaissance Press and Stephen Graham King have been kind enough to chip in a copy of the first 3 books in his amazing Maverick Heart Cycle. Now, there are people watching on Facebook and there are people watching here through Glide Day Books Zoom. So Renaissance is going to keep track of who wins this prize. This prize is going to be about who can answer my question in the chat roll, and it's going to be a first come, I'm afraid. But so the question is, and this is terrible to make you think, were you paying enough attention? In Stephen's reading, what was the name of the gentleman looking at himself in the mirror? And I'll let Renaissance handle that.
You're like, I know, give me the books.
I already have the books. All right, so again, thank you. That was wonderful, all of you. I'm so glad I went first and didn't have to follow any of you, frankly. We will also be taking questions. If you want to ask us questions, by all means, pop them into the chat. I will hunt them for them. And if you're all watching on Facebook, Renaissance is also monitoring Facebook, and we'll set some time aside at the end to get to your questions. So by all means, pop them in there, and we'll do our best to keep an eye on them. And I would like to start with the very basic beginning and ask everybody what brought us here today. What drew you to speculative fiction, and specifically, given the topic, what drew you to writing queer and disabled identities in speculative fiction? And why don't we start with you, Stephen?
One of my earliest memories is being 3 years old and sitting with my sisters watching first run Star Trek, the original series. And then shortly after that, when it hit syndication, it was on right after school. So I would race home from school and watch every episode after school every day. And I was kind of growing up in the time when CBC was this glorious source for all things British in terms of television shows. So Saturdays you get The Tomorrow People and Space 1999 and Thunderbirds and the original Avengers and all of these things. And that early experience of seeing it and experiencing it at such a young age, because it was one of the few things that my sisters and I watched together. And so it imprinted really early in terms of color and action. And I am diehard. It's like, give me something with like spaceships and ray guns and aliens, and I am in. It could be the worst written thing in the world. I will try. I will give it a go just because. So it always was there. And eventually, I mean, I didn't start writing until much later, obviously, but I read tons and always read SF. And there were things that I read in SF that they weren't granted a lot back then, but there would be things like I read an incredible short story from Rachel Pollack, who I found out fairly recently it was a trans woman. And she wrote this story called Second Generation, in which basically you can take a pill and change the physical sex of your body. So the main couple basically throughout the story are like boop, switching back and forth at will, whatever they want. And of course, being drama, things go horribly wrong. And the story ended with the two of them, but not telling you what physical sex their bodies remained. And as a teenager, that was like, they could be the same. That was like a revelation. Like that's possible. And there were other things like Vonda McIntyre. Some of her work was like coded bisexual couples or even overt plural marriages that were, and so it only made sense that eventually that would be where I would end up. And in the 80s, when I was becoming an adult and starting writing, was the beginning of that independent queer cinema with, Beautiful Laundrette and Parting Glances and Desert Hearts and all of these things. So it was like, oh, these people are telling stories for us now. And that was when the very first draft of what eventually became Soul's Blood was written, was the late 1980s, as kind of a response to that. I love science fiction. Why aren't there queer people? Oh, wait a minute. I could do that. So that it was kind of a long circuitous route, but science fiction has been in my brain since I was 3. So.
Nice. Yeah, I can totally relate to the having to race home to actually catch the show you wanted to catch. I'm not sure if anyone actually grasps what that's like these days, but how about you, Sienna?
Yeah, I do know what that's like. I had to tape late night anime episodes when I was a child, and if we missed one, there was a big stink. Yes, so I don't even know what my earliest memory of engaging with fantasy fiction, which is my sort of bread and butter, is. I think because of the fact that I mix it up with real life a lot. So it's one of those things where when I was a child reading fantasy fiction and like the things that were reflected in stories made sense, matched up, mirrored the things in my imagination and my experience of the world as an inherently magical place. Like that is still how I live my life today. It just made sense that like, oh yeah, that's the worldview. That's how you engage with life in a way that contemporary fiction or like literary fiction, like as I grew older, it's like, oh no, these are the things you're supposed to read. Like here's your high school curriculum, here's the classics. And sometimes classics can be very cool and sometimes they're not for me. Often because contemporary literature can really strip all of those elements out. And I find that in fantasy, the kind of fantasy that I'm really drawn to is that kind of soft fantasy where it's a little bit less about like the hard magic systems and like the dragons and wizards and I guess, hallmarks or touchstones of fantasy as a genre, and a little bit more about worldview of, again, everything as being sentient, everything as having a soul, everything as being inherently worthy of your respect, your regard, and possibly, your love. That kind of fantasy. Sometimes we call that magical realism. That's not really the name for it. But that was always the place that I operated from, due to just the brain that I've got, and the way that I like to live on this planet, and fantasy made sense. So of course I would graduate from reading it to writing it. And then it started, on the queer side of things, started to be an issue because I kept on finding all of these stories, which are like really lovely, except for the fact that it felt like all of these romances kept getting shoehorned in. It's like, does this have to happen every time? Please, I'm just trying to enjoy either the friendship, or like, these are some interesting concepts that you're working with, but no, they gotta smooch, or they gotta frick, and it just didn't work for me. Again, have your party, please. But I am part of that group of people that really loves it when you can find just like some really strong, like, pair bonded friends. Like, queer platonic partnerships are very important to me in media representation, because I think they're some of the most underrated and absolutely lovely relationships a person can have. So I started writing one, and then it took me like 9 years to finish writing it. And that's the duology. But also, just even in my poetry, I'm often exploring these things, because I find that while we've got tons of, these days, really excellent, we have Glad Day, we have a whole bookshop for wonderful representation of many different stripes of queerness. But until fairly recently, I didn't see very much ace representation, aro representation, those kinds of things that sometimes are discussed as a lack of something, often were sort of slid under the carpet. And that ain't it for me, because I exist. And I'm not the only one. And it's really fun to read stories about people like me who are, using the same kind of brain or the same kind of faculties that I have to solve problems and get into hijinks and have a nice time. So I think I have a very DIY mentality, and was like, well, if you can't find it, just make the thing. Just go for it. And I've been doing it ever since.
I love that. I have a very similar experience with how I got to urban fantasy, because the gay werewolf always died. Right. But I feel like I should take a moment and shout out the Ace Arrow database, maintained by
Clodie
Clodie
Arsenault. We
Yeah.
love Clodie.
Yeah. So if you're looking for more, I mean, obviously begin with Sienna. But once you have finished Sienna, jump online, find this database, because you can search and find all sorts of amazing subgenres, pairings, all sorts of stuff. It's wonderful. Avi.
Hello. So like Stephen, I'd say like my spec fic journeys started with watching Next Gen with my grandmother. Like every time I went to visit her, like my earliest memories are my grandmother in like a full Klingon cosplay, like just going to her conventions with her friends and hosting like Star Trek parties and Lord of the Rings parties. And like she took me to the theaters to see Lord of the Rings when it came out. And I was like, revelation. And like, we don't need to talk about like listen, gender euphoria, whatever. No one's had that conversation before. Or like, oh no, Viggo Mortensen, I guess I am still attracted to cis men. Yikes. Like, it's just like, there's very, I'd say Lord of the Rings did a lot for me, both on like a fantasy level and also on like a fantasy level. So I think it helped me figure some things out. But I think, I was just sort of surrounded by spec fic, and like, well, my therapist probably wouldn't phrase it this way. I had kind of a weird childhood, and being involved in anything that looked like the real world like wasn't interesting to me, because it's like, oh, this is a scary, dangerous, unreliable place of people who don't make sense. Like that was just sort of the way that I saw that, and I just didn't really attach to like contemporary fiction. Whereas with fantasy, I'm like, this is like a whole different place with a whole different set of rules and a whole different set of concerns. And it was a really safe place to explore like the themes I was dealing with in my life in a setting where it wasn't, looking them right in the face. Like instead of being like, I am a child who feels like I am in mortal peril. I was like, I'm just going to Mordor. I don't know why, just kind of busy. Like it was a good place for me to kind of figure that out. And I think it was very natural for me to work queerness into my own fantasy worlds, just because I like it. And I like writing about things I like. If I don't like it, I'm not going to write it. Like if I like it, I might not even write it. Like it's a very low chance I'm going to write anything. So if I'm going to, like, I better like it. And I think disability has been a lot harder for me because in order to write about disability, I had to come to terms with the fact that I was disabled, which I have not had an easy time of, which is like not very cool to say, but very true of what my experience has been. Both with, you know, I have Tourette's, so I tick. You're probably noticing me doing these cute dances. I can't stop. It's a condition. And it causes a lot of physical pain. So it's being like, all right, I'm not just like, this is debilitating pain. Like that's what that means. And also being someone who's neurodivergent and like mentally ill. I think before I identified that I think I was writing it before I knew I was writing it. Like just like the very funny thing of having Sienna point out that a character in a work in progress, it's like, is he bipolar? And I'm like, I didn't intend it that way. And Sienna's like, a bigger question. I'm like, oh, and then revelation. So I think I can't help but write my own experience into my work, which helps me process it. But I think SpecFic has always been, it felt like a really safe place to kind of work through that, because like the threat of institutionalization is not the same in my spec worlds. Often the threat of like the same stigma isn't present in the same way. And I can create the threats that I think I can manage. And I think that's something that's been very true of speculative fiction for me and my like queer and disabled identities.
Love that. That was wonderful. Thank you, all three of you. That was brilliant. Just quickly to note that Renaissance has found our winner, Jessie Scuz, or Scuz. I apologize if I've said your name wrong. You have just won 3 wonderful books. I can't wait for you to enjoy this ride. And actually, I am going to springboard basically, Sienna, on what you were previously just saying. And I'm going to ask you all, with speculative fiction comes technology or magic, if we're talking the fantasy side. And how do you fold that technology or magic alongside queerness and or disability? I feel like you've both already been touching on this, and Stephen's reading touched on this, into your world building. And I'll start with you, Sienna.
I'm so glad you asked. I was seriously considering reading a different thing for this panel specifically, because there's a conversation that is had between my sweet dear protagonist Renoa and a character that he meets in the second book whose name is Pashangali. Pashangali is the leader of her tribe of people. She's very young for it. She came into it through unfortunate circumstances. And at one point they're having a conversation. He's kind of been tasked with helping her through some issues that he's not entirely sure he knows how to mentor someone through. They're both figuring it out together. But they have this conversation and he goes, you know, if it's not disrespectful to ask, like, can I ask you how you got this job? Like, how did you're like younger than my sister is. Like, this is so much responsibility to put on somebody. And she tells her story, and part of it, partway through, it gets revealed that she is what is known in the Heartland as Lua Mujakti. Lua Mujakti gets broken down by the translator, who's there like, it kind of means this, like Lua, it's kind of a pun because Lua means perfect, but it's close to Lawa, which means two, but Mujakti's in the singular, so it's kind of like two things being one, but the one is bigger than the two together. What they're talking about is an intersex person. But there's this whole cultural understanding of it that also comes into something to do with perspective and having sort of a dual perspective or a multiple perspective, and therefore having the wisdom to lead a tribe or the wisdom to interface with the gods, things like this. And it's folded in such a way where kind of it gets kind of like, it's a regional thing. Don't ask me for details. Like, I'm not from here. And we move along, you know, there's other reasons why she's part of this. She also has She has a thing that they call the third mind in this place, which is synesthesia, mirror touch synesthesia, which is the roughest of the synesthesias, in case anybody out there has that. Sorry. As somebody who has a different kind of synesthesia, I don't deal with that, but it was interesting to explore of like, okay, this can be sometimes seen culturally as a really wonderful gift. And it is sometimes, in Pashanguli's case, incredibly difficult on a day-to-day basis. So there was some playing here with people just have lived experiences, and depending on the context around them and how people treat them, it can either be a wonderful, vaunted little, a journey that is full of awe and wonder, or it can be a real drag. And I wanted to make space for both of these things, because I don't think that we should have like the superhero disability situation going on, be like, oh, of course all of the disabled people are actually the magical people, but I also didn't want to be like, oh, it just sucks, like it's just bad all the time. You can have both, and then other things besides, neither of these things are the only things about Pashangali. She also has quite the attitude, like she has quite the character, and she was one of many different sort of essays, attempts to reconcile all these things in the shape of a human being that is supported then by the world building that she grew up in.
Nice. I love especially what you're saying about that. It can suck, but it can also be other things. You don't see that very often.
At the same time, even.
Yeah. How about you, Avi?
Yeah. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit about Pulling Futures, Plucking Time, which is my short story forthcoming in Nothing Without Us too. And this was a story that I wrote shortly after being diagnosed with bipolar, where I was basically trying to process the fact that, like, after an embarrassing incident with the wrong medication, I spent 3 months in hypomania, which was very much very intense. Called a lot of people, made a lot of choices, tried to buy a house with $10, didn't get the house. It was a really tiring period that I came out of with a lot of humiliation and a lot of frustration. And I couldn't figure out how to process that this had happened to me. And that it had been happening to me for years. But just on such a smaller scale that I'd never noticed. All I knew was that, I'd have these periods of like, where I was who I was supposed to be. I didn't need to sleep or eat because I was great and I could do anything actually, and don't get too close or I will freak out, like that, in between months of just like despair. And I just was like, I need to put this in a story somehow. I need to write this. And I ended up writing this story about a magic user who has sort of magic called pulling, where you can just pull things from air, pull things from other things, create things from things. And the story sort of begins with them coming to realizing their house is destroyed and trying to figure out what they were trying to make. And just that search. And I think for me, it was very important to use my magic system to demonstrate something on like a larger scale, to be like, how do I process this experience? Where for me, it's like, from the outside, it's like, you tried to buy a house with $10, like, what were you doing? But from the inside, I thought I was doing something beautiful. Like, I really thought I was making something wonderful. And I found that magic was a lot easier of a way to explore being in an altered state and what it's like to try to accept that I didn't get what I was looking for. And that was a bad time and it was dangerous and it was scary, but also I tried to make something beautiful, and like, there is beauty inside of me. And this is an expression of that, even if it's a little janky. So I think that's in my more recent work, one way that I would say I've intersected magic and disability.
I really like that. I'm so often we hear that, it is so incredibly difficult to explain something that you have not experienced, but metaphor goes so much easier into the other people's minds, right? And that, yeah, exactly.
And there is always the risk of allegory, because I think it's
right.
Like, when is it okay to use allegory and when is it not? But for me, I'm like, it's my crazy. I can use as much allegory as I want. Like, please bite me.
Yeah. The call is coming from inside the house. Yeah. Stephen.
It's interesting because in preparation for tonight, I kind of had the realization that I kind of addressed disability somewhat in Soul's Blood without even realizing I was doing it. You know, like I created I was building the character of Lexa Blue 30 odd years ago, and had inspiration from a character in comics who is this sort of, you know, tough mercenary who shot guns and did stuff, and she had facial tattoos. And then I saw another character that had a scar straight up and down along from the forehead, and I thought, okay, that's cool. And then rather than just an eye, it was like black, and it was like a prosthetic, and it could see stuff. So I did it without knowing I was doing it back then. And then this Ghostlight Burn is kind of the first time that I've consciously done it, because at the end of Congress of Ships, you know, boom, horrible injuries, then you're done that book, and you're starting to write the next one. You're like, oh God, what do I do now? I've done this horrible thing to this person, you know. And the temptation, I think, for so many people in science fiction-y high-tech environments is it's fixed, you know, like the Star Trek wavy thingy that fixes everything. And so it sort of had these multiple passes where it was kind of like, okay, he's okay. Okay, no, he's mentally not okay. And then, oh no, wait a minute. There's a physical thing as well. Because, I mean, as Tianna mentioned in my bio, I am a survivor of metastatic synovial sarcoma, which kills 90 to 95% of people who get it. So, and my left leg is pretty much reconstruction. There's metal parts, and there's stuff moved around, and it doesn't quite work the way it used to. And there's some nerve damage in my feet, and that sort of that pressure feeling that was in the scene that I read, that's a real thing that I could go, okay, this is a real sensation and a real thing that I could draw on to, you know, throw it in the blender and mush it up a little bit and stretch it out and put that in. So there was that aspect of exploring him and being able to go, okay, he's still got symptoms, he's still got mental symptoms, but he can still do the shit when he needs to. You know, he can still run around and do the kinds of stuff that he did before. And there was another thing that I was an aspect in this book of. It was actually the last panel that I was at CanCon that you were on, Nathan. There was somebody on the panel who was deaf, and I was sitting in the audience and listening and going, there's this technology that I've been using in all three of my books that is perfect for simultaneous translation of sign to words, like to verbal and back. So two people could literally have a conversation where one is signing and the other one is speaking, and they each get like subtitles, so can see the words. So it was like looking at technology not as a way to fix things, but as a way to adapt and make better assistive devices and make the world easier, and that it's small things that you can roll into characters that don't necessarily, you're not talking about the experience of being disabled. You are showing people living their lives and doing things in this society that has made, I won't say allowances, that's all I mean accommodate, that has used what they can do to make things easier. So that's kind of a, you know, how do you not just use technology to fix people, you use technology to help everyone in more and better ways, is what I'm trying to do.
Well, that's what I love about what you've done here, is that instead of it being about fixing or making the individual better, it's about making the world better. It's like, let's improve the environment, then the people can just be how they are.
Yeah, and that actually rolls into my next question wonderfully. You guys, you all couldn't have done that better. But I actually wanted to pick up Lexa Blue's eye chip for a second. One of the things I freaking adored is you made it perfectly clear that if she wanted to, she could have a perfectly normal looking eye and have that scar removed, and at no point does she even consider it. And that's such a, I mean, I know you talk about like you're not trying to make a statement, but whether or not you intended to, that was such a lovely moment. Like, no, this is a part of me, and this is as it is. And I really love that about Lexa Blue's character from step one. Like that's literally page one, I think. Okay, so my next question actually is literally what you were just talking about. We'll start with you, Avi. But so speculative fiction it can often be pretty bleak. And I'm not saying that there isn't room for that, but often the queerness or the disability comes from a place of resistance. But all three of you tend, I find, to actually write your speculative fiction more from a place of accommodation and acceptance. And I would love to hear how you chose, or do you choose, or how that evolves, how you sort of work the queer and disabled narratives into your worlds the way you did, with that sense of this is not a fight, I guess is what I'm saying. And we'll start with you, Avi.
Yeah, great question. I think this was something that when I started writing Two Dark Moons was really exciting for me, because I was like, well, I want to write a book that either lets like it's a YA book that either lets like trans kids feel seen or helps cis kids see trans kids. And I was like, how do we walk both, so I'm not doing 101 for trans readers who know who they are, and not going like you don't know anything to cis readers who like are open to learning. So it was really a matter of trying to write something that expressed a lot of elements of queer and trans identity without getting anyone trapped in the 101 of like love to coming out stories, but baby's first coming out story. Like it's not, I think it's great that some people still want to write them. I'm not ever going to tell people to stop doing it, but I just didn't feel the need to this time. So I think what I did was I constructed a world where transness was no issue, where gender is assigned based on your lunar phases as opposed to your body, but it's still assigned. So, and there's still roles and there's still things. So there are many Earth equivalent trans people all over it. And the main character was born under a lunar phase so unlucky that she was meant to be cast out of her community as a baby and sort of left to die. And her parents save her from that. But she knows that she is different, and that if people knew, what would happen, and can she accept herself, and does she actually fit better as this identity, even though it's not okay? And so what I wanted to do was still be able to explore what to me are very classically trans themes of found family, finding comfort with yourself, connecting with other people, and doing that all without making it about being trans. Like I wanted the reassurance that like you are trans and you are loved and you are beautiful and you are perfect in every single fucking way. And you still feel these things, like absolutely, and sort of to hold that dialectic. And I think also something that was really important to me was expressing relationships between like people who are ace and people who are not, people who are aro and people who are not, like getting into the fact where it's like, you know what, like queer platonic relationships aren't just like ace, they aren't just aro, they aren't ace, aro. Like that's not, you can be in these in these relationships, it's okay. And to give a place to explicitly explore that negotiation and like present the idea that like you love me differently than I love you. We do this fundamentally differently, but we do love each other and we want to be committed to each other, so we do. And I think that was something that I really wanted to weave into my work. And writing the Sound Cycle has been an interesting process because it's very much about writing that identity in the way that accesses as much joy and possibility like as possible without dismissing the experiences of the readers who might not be getting that in real life or might be, you know, do what you do.
How about you, Stephen?
Well, it's interesting to me. Many moons ago, when I was initially writing Soul's Blood, I sent it off to Candace Jane Dorsey in Edmonton. She was running a press at the time. And this is back in the day where you you mailed like this whole thing to people. And she read through it, and it turned out by sheer coincidence, I was going to be in Edmonton visiting friends, and she took me out for lunch and gave me some feedback over lunch, which was fantastic. But I had initially written it that one of the characters' fathers had a problem with him being gay. And she just looked at me across the table and went, "Oh God, it's the future. Are we still doing that?" and I remember going, you're right. And so from then on, I took that out and changed the conflict, which again made the reason why him and his father were having so many problems was something completely different. And so that eventually evolved into my attitude of queer is never the problem. People can be greedy, people can be selfish, people can be stupid, people can be arrogant, but nobody's bugged about sexuality or identity. So that kind of opened up a bunch of possibilities. But at the same time, it's challenging because how do you, I wrote a character in Congress of Ships who had appeared briefly at Gatecrasher and then became a major character in Congress of Ships. I was like, okay, I wanted her to be trans. I was like, oh, Sindel is trans. Why didn't I? Of course. But then how do you write a character who's trans in a world where nobody cares about whether you're trans or not? How do you establish that? And it ended up being just like a brief paragraph of things that two people had said to each other as they were getting to know each other, things that they had revealed to each other as they became acquainted and developed a relationship. So then come Ghostlight Burn, it was like, okay, well, I'm in. We got disabled people. Okay, there's a character over here. They're non-binary. Okay, he's ace. Okay, and just was like, oh, he's deaf. You have these characters, and just changing your perception to go, what is the not default thing I can do here? What is the character will still fulfill their exact same purpose for the narrative, but we can change who they are in the world and maybe show something more about the world by showing that they function perfectly fine. I'm in the process of struggling to write the next book, but I wanted to create a character that uses a power chair. And so that character is very highly placed in a very prestigious organization, handles a ton of stuff, has this power chair that gets them around, and has manipulators on it that function instead of hands and the fact that they are in a chair is irrelevant to what they do in the story, who they are, what their purpose is, how they propel the narrative onwards. It's just looking at opportunities to say, okay, this person doesn't have to be white. They don't. This is cisgender. They don't.
Yeah.
Straight. Just what can you do to flip the switch and change that narrative somehow as you're propelling the story forward.
Nice. And Sienna?
I think I want to acknowledge at this point that there's a really interesting mechanical difference between writing what you've been through, what you experience, and attempting, again, to include and welcome and embrace characters who have lived experiences that are not your own. We are 4 white people, as far as I know, hanging out on this call. So, our experiences are not the only ones out there, and we should definitely go out and ask a bunch of other people about their experiences. They also have awesome ideas. So, for me, I think that this is about reveling in the infinite variety and diversity of the human animal. Evolution and diversification as a natural process is a joyful thing. The universe just makes shit and is like, let's see what happens, and is joyful about it. And we should be too, because we're part of that. This is the worldview coming in again, like anything that is is inherently fascinating because it exists. It's not oblivion. It's a thing. It has ontology, right? It's real, whatever real means to you. And different experiences of orientation, sexuality, attraction, disability, perception, sensory ability, motor ability, all these things, right, are different ways of experiencing reality. And they're all super interesting, right? And so for me, as someone who's really inquisitive about just like the infinite ways that you can do life, it's always been just really a fun thing for me to dive in and be like, okay, let's see, how much can you inhabit this? How much research do you have to do? When does the research have to stop and you just have to feel it? When do you have to ask people? And what do you have to ask them? What is respectful to ask them? Like all these different things. And that's kind of the research and craft part of it. But when it comes to how are you going to portray it? Are you going to show it as an oppressive fight kind of thing, as an aggressor and you know, the underdog and all that? Or are you going to show it as just like, either we're past that or we never got there in the first place? We just never went down that road of, I am afraid of that which is different from me, because reasons. That's where I like to go. I've mentioned I've probably said the word worldview like 7 times at this point, but truly that's where it starts, because that's where the whole story blossoms from, right? Your book says, or your short story or your poetry or whatever it is, says a lot about what your little hindbrain thinks the world is, or what your character thinks the world is, which is often informed by what you think the world is. Then maybe you know as a writer, right? And I'm always aware of that, like not that I know everything going in there, but that I'm so excited about that. I'm just like, oh, there's probably things in there that people will pick up on and be like, you believe this thing, don't you? And I'd be like, oh my God, you're right, I do. One of the things I believe is that the infinite variety of the human animal is a wonderful thing. So there's an anecdote that happens in this book where Renoa has a conversation with somebody he's met on his travels, whose name is Sephrastus, and they're kind of like passing through this, they're on a caravan journey through the plains of this particular country named Chiropoli. And they sit down and have this sort of heart-to-heart in the early dawn hours before everybody else is awake. It's just the two of them sitting on this hill looking at like these pepper farms. And so it's very atmospheric. And this young man tells him his story, which ultimately ends up being a like, my family found out I was gay and that's not allowed here. And the reason why I wanted to put it in there was because it's very much the exception to the way the rest of the world operates. And I wanted to show that this was the exception. You know, Renoa as the perspective character is there like, I don't get it. Like, he's just like, it just bounces off him. He's like, I don't understand. What do you mean? He has to go through this whole cultural clash thing of like, well, we do it this way where I'm from. I don't understand. We don't even have a word for that where and they have to kind of come to this understanding. And eventually, you know, it's like, oh, sounds awesome where you're from. He's like, yeah, it's got its pros and cons, but this, I guess, is one of its pros. But then everywhere else that you go in the following, you know, countries and nations and lands and cultures that we encounter, it's just like not even an issue. It's not even brought up. There's all kinds of different, you know, experimental things happening, that some of which are being very consciously created of like, oh, let's like play academically with gender and like, let's create a whole new one because it's cool. Why not? Like as a culture, they're engaged in this. Versus Chiropoli, which kind of has the homophobe thing going on. And so the reason why that's there is to point it out is this is very much unusual. You know, everybody else on this continent kind of looks at Chiropoli like, interesting, that you think that. That's interesting, you know? And I like to do that because I feel that there's probably, as much as I would love to inhabit, I guess, a world where everyone is totally cool all the time with every single expression of this diversity, that's a very long shot, simply because there's access frictions, people trigger each other, like it's a thing, and I don't consider what I write to be wish fulfillment in that way. You know, I want to dig into the wonder of the experience and also the stress of it and also the tensions of it. And so I didn't see fit to just like write a whole world where like none of this was an issue, partially because I don't know how. I don't have that information. I am a mortal. I don't know how to solve all of these systemic issues that create racism, create disability as a social model. I don't know how to solve all of that in my secondary fantasy world. It's like, I don't know if anyone does. So I'm not going to try, but what I am going to try is look at specific experiences and go, okay, let's integrate those. Or let's try to integrate those and see what happens and see what new interesting problems arise when that's off the table. Because I think those secondary things can be really interesting as well.
I'm actually going to bounce the next question straight at you because you've done such a lovely lead into it. So even though you're all writing speculative fiction, like other worlds, futures, whatever, your audience lives here in reality. How do you bridge there to the here and now, or how conscious are you of it, or do you? And I feel like you led right into that, so that's why I'm jumping right back to you, Sienna.
Oh, let's go. In case anyone who's watching does not already know about how much anxiety is in this book, I'm gonna tell you right now, if you are prone to panic attacks, get ready. Because I cannot tell you the number of people, like people I know, and also just like reviewers on the land of the internet being like, this made me reevaluate my life. Mostly because of the fact that Renoa is intensely socially anxious, and I wrote it to be uncomfortable. You know, I wrote it to be a difficult experience for the reader. Fantasy is so often thought of as escapist fiction, and that is a wonderful thing. We should be able to escape wherever we want, whenever we want, for any reason we want to, and then come back when we feel like we want to come back. Having said that, I love the idea of flipping it and taking something that is traditionally seen or archetypally seen as an escapist, just sort of like, I'm not going to worry about my problems, I'm just going to go and do the thing. And instead, what you find is 180,000 words of somebody trying desperately to build up the self-confidence and the self-esteem to face his own anxiety square on and embrace it with compassion. It's hard to watch if you're in the midst of it. You know, you see the way that he thinks to himself and addresses himself, and you're like, shit, I've been there before. This is so hard to read because I know those words. But sometimes I've heard when people read it, they're like, and they recognize it, they go, oh my God, that's right, I do talk to myself that way. And you really shouldn't, because like he's fine. Like they get to see him as an outside contemporary perspective, as someone who's outside his head, and they go, but you're doing fine, baby. Like you're okay. You're average. You're maybe like you're not the disaster that you think you are. And then slowly over time, the connection gets made, and they're like, I'm okay. And that was the plan all along, you know, that was the point, was to provide sort of processing space, but in the midst of this very colorful, luscious mythology, you know, and this fantasy to give you some space to breathe when you need it, because it's tough work. So for me, it was a very conscious decision to take a reader a very specific kind of reader with a very specific mentality, and give them a bridge into a world that looks very sparkly and interesting, and like, oh, we're just going to go on a romp, and then flip it and be like, so it's time to talk about your mental health.
I'm pitching Captain America sitting down on his chair. How about you, Avi? You also mentioned this earlier as well when you were talking about like the lunar cycle, sort of not quite standing in, but having that like, hey, here's a real world thing, but we're not going to make you read the real world thing. But it was that was conscious.
Yeah. That was very conscious. This question is very fun for me in my mind, because my answer feels like kind of like that, like if I'm writing about people, I notice you're also a person. Could we connect? Like there's just, I'm not sure how to answer.
You're not writing for squids?
I don't know. I have this for like when I'm reading a book, it's like, maybe it's about space, but I'm like, they're a person with a mind. What if I was in space? Like they just sort of add up a little bit. So I think for me, like writing authentic character experience for me is much more important important for me than the world building. Like I say, as someone who like runs a world building initiative, I'm sorry. Like I love world building. Sometimes I'm like, you know how some writers are like, I love writing every day. I write. Writing's so good. I know I hate writing. I like editing. I write because I want a book at the end of it. The process is torture. Don't make me do it. But I find like the thing I enjoy about the process, because there is one thing, is the character work and being like, okay, I want to make a person. Like I want to grow a person right here who's reacting to their surroundings. Now I'm going to make the speculative surroundings. So usually rather than going world first, characters second, I go, this is the character I'm engaging with. What is the world that I need to bring out the qualities in the characters that I would like my readers to engage with, befriend, and disdain? And so I think very much the bridging comes from starting always from the standpoint of like, this is another person. And letting the speculative element be the when you're eating cheese and crackers, you want the cheese, but the cracker is the thing that delivers you the cheese. I'm sorry, I can't remember the words.
Vehicle, the vessel.
Vehicle, thank you. So like the cheese is the character experience and the ability to connect. The cracker is the world building. I'm a professional author.
I love everything about this metaphor, and I'm going to use it forever.
Take it, please take the credit too. It's yours. Don't let me have this.
Love it. And you, Stephen? Do you have any cracker wisdom?
Cracker wisdom. Though I'm writing like crazy adventures that that people like daring escapes and car chases and spaceship like each plot has sort of nudged slightly up against something real world that we deal with now. There was Soul's Blood has a conflict between two cultures that have really deep rooted reasons to not trust each other. And then Gatecrasher was about skeevy corporations trying to monopolize the technology themselves. And Congress of Ships touched on that some of the characters were refugees. So there's these sort of bumping up against real things that, even though they are told in a fantastic way, they are situations that are in some way recognizable. And then on top of that, characters that feel things. They feel things about what's going on. They experience what's happening in certain ways, and it affects them differently. And they make friends, and all of the books have had characters that sort of come and go and show up again later in a different book in a different way, because people have those types of people. You don't necessarily have one enclosed bubble of characters in this book and then a completely different bubble of characters in this book. So people disappear and come back and show up again, and this is going to be my equivalent of the cracker metaphor. Is the end of Die Hard 2. And the plot has ended, everybody's been saved, and Bonnie Bedelia, his wife, looks at him and goes, why does this keep happening to us? There's this moment of absolute, of course, that's what someone would say if this incredibly ridiculous, outlandish set of circumstances had happened to them twice.
Right.
That there's that moment of an actual genuine human reaction to a set of outlandish circumstances. That if you bring in those moments of humanity, that even though people are flying spaceships and shooting guns and saving planets and stuff, that they're still, people are going to have feelings about that. and it's going to cause them problems. And in Ghostlight Burn, the character that comes back is a character from 2 books ago who went off because the thing that happened was too much for her. And so, she went off and did other things. And then, of course, found herself right in the middle of it all again. So she gets to come back and we get to see her in a new way, in a new phase of her life. So those are the types of things where it's like people are actually going through these things, right? They're actually happening to human beings.
That continuity of just lived experiences having an impact. Yes. Believe it or not, we are 5 minutes away from the end. I cannot believe how fast that went by. I want to thank every them. You've all been amazing. But two quick things before I sort of let the curtain fall. First of all, thank you, all of you. That was wonderful. And also a reminder to make sure that you hop on over to Glad Day Books and thanking Glad Day Books for hosting us. If you drop it by at gladdaybookshop.com, all spelled out running together, you can find all of these wonderful authors' titles for sale. And I believe, and again, as was stated at the beginning, opening soon, I hope. I hope we can see each other's faces soon. So what I'm going to do to cycle us out is, first of all, thank Renaissance Press for organizing this alongside Glad Day. And then I'll ask each of you just to tell us where we can find you. And Avi actually jumped the gun on my final little outro question. I was going to say that you're all in Nothing About Us too, I believe. So it would be lovely if you just mentioned what your story was about on the way out. Talk about it again, Avi, or some other thing that you'd like to bring up, your choice. So I will let you go last, just so you have time to think, since I kind of stole that answer from you early, or you stole the answer from me, technically. So let's start with Sienna. Tell us where we can find you, and then what your story's about, and Nothing About Us too.
Sure thing. So my name is Sienna Tristen. That's Tristen with an E, not an A. You can find me at siennatristen.com, or if you want to see updates and fun retweets of foxes, you can find me on the Bird app on Twitter at Sienna Tristen. My story in Nothing Without Us 2 is the opening story, which is very exciting, a coveted position. It's a cute little 500-word, very short story called A Tour of the Facilities. And it is a very tongue-in-cheek piece, is a very unlike what I usually write. What I usually write, as I've discussed, is very ethereal and involved. And this is very much like a womp womp kind of situation where our protagonist is drawn into the world's worst hotel resort, lovingly named Sensory Hell. And it's just shown around. It's just, what have we got for you? What have we got on offer? You like terrible sticky floor feeling? We have that. You want to go eat food that's way too spicy or just too weirdly textured for you? It's here. It's only here. There's nothing else, unless you brought your own bread. We hope you did. And it just kind of continues like that. So this is a sort of way for me to make light of my own sensory processing issues, and also to stand in cheeky solidarity with everybody else who deals with it, because the world can sometimes be a very sharp-edged and weirdly smelling place. And I know that I'm not the only one who thinks that. So it was kind of an ode to that.
Nice. Stephen?
I can be found at stephengrahamking.com. All my social media is there. There's blog posts and photos and all kinds of stuff. My story for Nothing Without Us 2 is yet another Maverick Heart story called Visiting Hours. I wanted to write it was a kind of a question of, I don't know if it happens to anybody else, where it's like there's a call and you go, I don't know, I don't have anything. Oh wait, I have something. And I wanted to write the moment of change, because for some people, disabilities evolve. And for some, there is a very clear before and after, as there was for me. And so I wanted to write about somebody in that moment of after is just starting. And because I had written disabled characters, I wanted the disabled characters to basically show up for this person and go, look, this is what you can expect. There's going to be some good stuff. There's going to be some, this is kind of how it's going to go. And show disabled people showing up for each other the way people showed up for me when it was my turn.
Lovely. Yeah. Actually, that's something I've noticed in all of your works, is the prevalence of community. It's incredibly strong. Avi, lead us out.
Oh, I love to. So my story, as I mentioned, is Pulling Futures, Plucking Time. It's about magic and mania and mentor figures who take it all very well. And yeah, I already talked a bit about this, so I won't go too much into it. And you can find me primarily on Twitter at the Scream Bean. There's pictures of reptiles, Jewish chaos, and me just being mentally ill, but like in a funny way. And if you want to see all of my outdated bios and outdated pictures and outdated information generally, you can go to mixavisilver.com.
I feel so seen.
That's what I got. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. You were wonderful.
And thank you to Nathan for guiding this discussion.
Oh.
Yay, thank you, Nathan.
Moderator extraordinaire. Thank you so much.
Thank
It's been
you.
a pleasure.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.